took us prisoner in your fight to be free. Little white lies.
Sergo, it is Friday, June 15th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people with a look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy and independence and distinction. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE, in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com, and we are streaming live on Facebook. We post these shows on SoundCloud after the show, and we post the videos on YouTube by tomorrow. We get them up usually a day after. So there's a number of ways to catch the show. Look, I am John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer, and I want to thank Kelly McMillan for our setup. She is the studio engineer who has done our setup, and who we're gonna actually do some improvements and some upgrades here coming up shortly. So I wanted to give a shout out to Kelly. Look, we opened up with Pappy John's band with and Murray Porter, Little White Lies, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Unless you're living under a rock, you've been hearing an awful lot about what a travesty it is that the United States and their Attorney General Jeff Sessions and President Donald Trump are stripping kids away from their parents, and these are immigrant children, children who are oftentimes their parents are trying to flee not just poverty, but they're trying to flee oppression and all kinds of. They're seeking asylum, many of them. And the first thing that the government is, the U.S. government is doing, is hoodwinking the parents, telling them, okay, we're just going to take care of your kids, and then they strip them away, and giving the parents no way to reach out and even contact their kids again. So they're literally ripping, sometimes screaming and crying children out of the arms of their mothers. And of course, what we're hearing is what an outrage it is, how terrible this thing is, and on every front, you've got people saying this is a travesty and that it's un-American. Well, that is one thing I'm going to put to rest, because this is a very American practice. This is such a common American practice, I might add, that it has history written all over it. So we're going to go through some of that. But the interesting thing is how this is being played out. I mean, I listened to Donald Trump saying, well, it's the Democrats' fault. They crafted a law that's forcing us to do it. And that's just a flat out lie. I mean, this is a policy that is being done under the Trump administration. And to be clear, they aren't just doing it because they claim the law dictates that they do it, which it doesn't. This is a policy decision. This is not. I mean, I've talked about this before. Let me explain. There is law, and then there's regulations, which is how the law is implemented. And then there's policy. And policy is where the discretion part comes in, and how the regulations are put into practice. So there's the law, which says, okay, it's illegal to come into the country, without proper documentation. Okay. And then there's the regulations that stipulate, okay, what you do when somebody breaks that law, how you administer dealing with the infraction and that kind of stuff. And no place in the regulations does it specifically say, and nor has it ever been really done in this way, does it say you strip kids away from their parents. Because here's the other thing this administration is doing. They're saying that the reason that they're implementing a zero tolerance rule, and they're being so forceful, they think this is such an unsavory thing to do, this is such a tragic thing to do, that it'll be a deterrent. So this is being done intentionally to be abusive. This is being done so that any would-be illegal immigrant would think twice about having their children ripped away from them, quite possibly never to be seen again. I mean, honestly, I mean, there's no way once a child is stripped from their parents in this circumstance to be. They haven't even developed a system for reuniting the children with their parents. So, I guess I want to be clear. This is not something mandated by law. This is a policy decision by this administration, and then to listen to that moron of an attorney general go off and say that somehow that this has a biblical validation to it. And let me again, this sometimes when I'm forced to read some of this stuff, it's just incredible. But so here's what Jeff Sessions he was citing Romans 13, which basically the quote is a little bit different, but this is what Romans 13 says: is let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So basically what he's saying is that Paul in Romans said that anybody who violates the law is violating God, that they are disrespecting and they are, essentially resisting God's authority. Because what he's trying to say is that this government, the United States, is ordained by God. Forget all that separation of church and state thing that you thought existed. You've got the attorney general, the highest law enforcement individual, the attorney general of the United States, saying that the United States government, Donald Trump, because I mean, if you break down, if you really parse this whole thing about what Romans 13 says, it says, let me go a little farther. This is for there's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. And then he goes on to say that rulers are not a terror for those who do good works, but only for those whose works are rooted in evil. So he goes on to say that any ruler that exists is ordained by God. Otherwise, God never would have allowed him to be the ruler. So he's essentially saying that Trump has been ordained by God to be a ruler of people. And look, this is like the biggest lie that was ever told. Not to mention the fact that this is probably a gross misinterpretation of what was written originally anyway. I mean, this whole idea that governments, that you must obey governments because Paul said so in Romans 13. I mean, give me a freaking break. And of course, if you go on farther and you want to read more, or before this chapter and verse and after this chapter and verse, you find there's much more written in the Bible that would condemn this activity than would justify it. So I had to get into that crap. Just the idea that this prudish white man is standing up there quoting twisted up Bible scripture to justify what he's doing to families. It's just absurd. But I mean, and again, keep in mind what he's saying is that governments are ordained by God. Well, we're going to do a little bit of a history journey here, because the other thing that I find pretty outrageous, and I mentioned that it's in the posting before the show, that this is among the epitomes of white privilege. When I hear Americans who are outraged about this, and they're right to be outraged, but when I hear Americans say, and white people in particular, because that's what you're hearing, white people say this is un-American. Because I got to tell you, if I hear a black person say it or a native person say it, then shame on them, because they have obviously, are forsaking history. Because this is where I want to go with this thing. There is almost nothing more American than punishing, torturing, and abusing children of color. It is as American as Yankee Doodle. I mean, that's what they do. And before I even get into the native issues, let me just talk about black people and the history that black people have experienced in the United States under this ordained by God government, okay, and previous governments, because we sometimes view that slavery was all about ripping a bunch of Africans off the continent and bringing them to America, bringing them to the Western Hemisphere, transatlantic trade, and turning them into slaves. And that's where all the slaves came from. Well, not quite. That's not quite true. So let me give you some numbers to explain it. In the from the 1500s until the mid 1800s, a total of 12.5 million individuals, mostly men, but women as well, were subject to the transatlantic slave trade. So 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped, stolen, imprisoned, and enslaved and put on ships to come across the Atlantic. Now, not all of them made it. About 2 million of them died on the journey. So about 10.5, actually a little bit more than 10.5, 10.7 survived the accommodations of transatlantic travel. 10.7. But if you're wondering, okay, out of that 10.7, most of them went to the Caribbean, to South America, to other places. So you got to be wondering, okay, out of that 10.7 million, how many came to North America? And there's some pretty good records for this stuff. Less than 400,000. Less than 400,000 of the 10.7 million who were subject to the transatlantic slave trade were shipped to the United States. Total. I mean, that's all the way up to 1860. A total of 388,000 Africans were stripped from their homelands and bound in by chains and sent to North America. The rest of them were all enslaved down south. And when I say down south, I'm not talking about Alabama. I'm talking about Brazil. I'm talking about the Caribbean, Cuba, all of the the Caribbean islands, and there were and of course Puerto Rico and the Isles of Espanol and all of and all of South America. That's where the vast and overwhelming majority, like I said, out of 10.7 million, only 0.4, less than 0.4 made it. They were brought to North America. Over 10 million Africans were enslaved and sent to South America or Central America or the Caribbean. So it's important to know that. So again, if there was only if there only less than 400,000 Africans were subjected to American slavery, that's an important thing to know, because when you look at the slave population, even as it grew from the when America became the United States. So in 1790, there were 700,000 slaves. It goes to 900,000 by 1800. By the time you get to the 1840, there's 2.5 million. By the time you get to 1860, in the run up to slavery being made illegal, there's 4 million slaves in the United States. So wait a second, how could there be 4 million slaves when only less than 400,000 were? Well, where do you think they came from? It was children of slaves who were bound into slavery. So while all you white people are being outraged about what the Republicans, what Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump are doing to these kids, and you should be, how can you stand there and say this is un-American when for the first century of the United States existence, only 400,000 Africans that population had increased tenfold by subjecting children to slavery. And you know what? They didn't just become slaves sitting there within mom and dad's reach. They were sold off. I mean, they were sold off for 100 years. Black children were being stripped from their parents, for 100 freaking years. And you're going to sit there and say that what's happening to immigrants is un-American? No, it's quite American, folks. All right, now let me spend a little bit of time talking about the Native experience. We had millions of Native children who were orphaned because of American policy. Started with Europeans, sure. But we had millions of Native children who were left to die because of massacres, because of the intentional spread of disease, the removal period. I mean, people talk about a third of the population of the Cherokees dying in the Trail of Tears. Well, who the hell do you think those were? Do you think that they were robust young men that died? It was elderly. It was children. It was children. And of course, it doesn't end there, because beyond the death sentence that many of that the removal period represented, because it wasn't just the trails of tears. It's where our Native people were left to fend for themselves in a land that wasn't really theirs, because now they were transplanted. And they had to figure out a whole new way of life. Everything that they have lived for, everything they knew, every custom for survival had to be altered to a new place. And that caused extreme poverty. It caused more death, weakened immune systems and the whole bit. But see, it doesn't stop there. Because around the time that some resistance started developing towards the abuse of black people in terms of slavery, there was a real effort to try to make Native people who hadn't been obliterated completely, hadn't been wiped off the face of the earth with their population. Although I will say, by the mid to late 1800s, our population, the total population of Ongwe had diminished to only about 250,000 people, from what may have been 40 or 50 million people in North America. And it may have been reduced as low, the numbers suggest as low as 250,000 people. That's how much our population had been eliminated. I mean, by some estimates, in North and South America and the Americas, the Native population had been obliterated and wiped out to the tune of 95, some say as high as 98% of our population was wiped out. And there was children involved in that, folks. So, to the survivors, you have been forced to live in abject poverty right up to today, based on American policy. But what about the children? So, like I was saying, at the time that slavery was really becoming a debate, and frankly, at the time that slavery was ended, the U.S. had other policies that were every bit as oppressive. In fact, Native children were being ripped from families, ripped from the families to be forced into prisons that they called residential schools. These residential schools were tantamount to prisons because the kids couldn't leave. They had no permission. The parents couldn't come pick them up. And oftentimes these residential schools, they weren't like a school bus didn't pick them up and take them to them every day. No, sometimes they were sent in boxcars, hundreds or thousands of miles away from their home, with the whole intent to be what can only be described as genocide by many of the definitions or the characteristics of genocide, which was to destroy them as a people, to completely alter them in such a way that they would no longer exist as Native people. The policy was kill the Indian, save the man. And kill wasn't just a metaphor. It wasn't hyperbole, because many children died in these residential schools. Not just died from neglect or malnutrition or because they got sick. Many died because they were beaten, they were murdered, or they were intentionally malnourished or intentionally allowed to die from illness. Tuberculosis was claiming at certain times on the Canadian side, the mortality rate was at or above 50% due to tuberculosis alone. These children were stripped from their parents. And I don't know, okay, so how long did that last? That couldn't have lasted for too long. 100 years, folks. So for the first 100 years of the United States' existence, they are, what they're doing to black people is atrocious. But for that 100 years and then the next 100 years, so in the first 100 years of the United States' existence, they're still massacring and murdering Native people. And that would continue until 1890, right? That's what they call the bookend of the Indian Wars. That's when the massacre at Wounded Knee would take place, and supposedly the massacres ended there. Well, we can debate that. But the residential schools didn't. The stripping away of children. And keep in mind, this stripping away of children had the effect not just of ethnic cleansing in terms of ridding them of everything. Because the first thing that a Native child had to go through was get their hair chopped off. They had to, of course, they went through the whole delousing, issues, and like white people were so much cleaner than Native people. We can get into that debate on another show. But they got prepped to be dressed and look as much like white people as their dark skin will allow. They were fed an overdose of Bible. Yeah, the same thing here that, same Bible that Jeff Sessions and others want to cite as justification for abusing children. So they were fed large dosages of the Bible. They were put to work. So essentially they were enslaved. And for all of the field work and that they were forced to do in terms of tending crops and stuff like that, they were never taught a skill. They were just put to work. Just basic, animal style, slave style labor. And yet they were still malnourished. But it was more than that. It was during this time that some of the sterilization programs were developed that would take Native women, girls, children, really, but they would take Native, our young women, and they would make sure they could never bear children. So that was a way to further their ethnic cleansing, further that genocide. But on top of stripping children away from their parents, they would make sure that the girls that were stripped away from their parents would never be parents. And not all of them were sterilized, but it almost doesn't matter how many, as if any were, and that's exactly what was being done. But the other thing that this act did is it separated that whole relationship of child to parents. So we had 100 years of children in these schools, and not every child went to these schools, but a lot did. Many did. I mean, this was a policy that was both a U.S. and Canadian policy. And so what these children experienced was to strip them of any association with parents and parenting. So these children would not know how to be parents. These children wouldn't know anything about parenting. And these weren't skills that were being taught to them, that's for damn sure. The women were taught to be housemaids, essentially domestic servants. And the boys, they were taught to be soldiers. They were taught to march and take orders and all of that stuff. They weren't taught, for all of the conversation about, well, we're gonna show these kids can be transformed into productive American citizens. Look, they did some things. One of the things they did, especially at the Carlisle Indian School, they wanted to prove a point that they could take these savages and teach them to play football. And that's where Jim Thorpe and some other fine athletes came out of these schools, and they exploited them. I mean, they exploited it because they wanted to prove that as white men, they could even take an ignorant savage and turn them into a skilled and honed organize a sports team. They were taking kids, younger kids who were only high school level, and they were putting together football teams to play against Ivy League schools, because the Ivy League schools were the ones that were the premier athletes at the time. But again, no skill sets. They weren't being taught professions. They weren't teaching these kids to be doctors and lawyers. And to the extent that they were being forced into field work, at farms and tending crops, they weren't taught to be farmers. They were taught to be essentially migrant workers. So this is the American history. So when I open this show with Little White Lies, Murray Porter singing Little White Lies, man, we got to come off of some of this stuff, folks. And for all of you outraged Americans, I don't want to hear you saying how un-American this is. What I want to hear you saying is, we never seem to learn from history. We keep going back to the darkest parts of American history and repeating it over and over and over again. And the bastion of much of this stuff comes from the whitest and the white supremacists and the redneckest bunch of them all. Jeff Sessions, Donald Trump. These are overt racists that are repeating the same racist crimes. And I say they're crimes, but not according to Jeff Sessions, because if the government was doing it, then that government was ordained by God, folks. If the government said slavery was legal, then God was allowing slavery. Why so many black people are Christians is beyond me. But I got to tell you, God ordained that 100 years or several hundred years of slavery that you had to endure. God ordained your children being stripped from you because they were born into slavery. And the native people, you got to ask yourself the same thing. If you believe what Jeff Sessions is saying, what he's saying that everything we experienced at the hands of the United States, including what we're experiencing today, is God's will. Because this government wouldn't exist if it wasn't ordained by God. Man, that's the world that we're living in. And this is the crazy talk that comes out of Washington. And like I said, I got to tell you, white folks, you better understand that what's happening to these brown people is the same thing that happened to native people, the same thing that happened to black people, and the same thing that's been happening in this country before it was the United States. So how dare you say what is happening to those children is un-American? Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour. We're going to take a break, and we'll come right back. I'm all pumped up, so we'll come back after this. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Can't you hear the baby crying? Can't you see the parents trying to give their child a better life? Works an honest day for his honest pay, still can't seem to get ahead. Stay on that straight and narrow path. Don't give up now. How long can this last? The time will come when night skies don't finish last, when the good don't die young. You know the time will come, the time will come. Say that your heart is cold, been hurt so many times before. Don't turn your back found precious love. There's somebody walking around feeling like you are now. They ain't gonna come to your front door. Open up your heart, don't get down. What goes around will surely come around. The time will come when night skies don't finish last, when the good don't die young. You know the time will come, time will come. So keep your dream alive, keep it burning deep inside.
All right, thanks for coming back. Time will come. Well, man, I don't know. It just seems like history repeats itself because everybody wants to ignore what has taken place in the past. It's just incredible. A little bit more from Murray Porter, Pappy John's band. Look, Let's Talk Native is sponsored by Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420, Mike General and his shops, Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium, and individuals that step up, guys like Ed Schindler, folks like Cynthia Trice and Roger Jock, friend of mine from Akwesasne, Neville Spring, my friend from Tonawanda, and many who have helped this show in the past. They may not be kicking in today, but we're in our 9th year, and we wouldn't be here if we didn't have support from people every step along the way. So even those who have helped in the past, who may not be contributing today, I thank you for your support. I thank you for helping me to educate, entertain, and inform for over 8 years. So I can't thank you enough. So I do so at every occasion I can. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE again for their simulcast and the rebroadcast of the show. I also want to thank the Internet radio networks. So I want to thank Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, Indigenous Resistance Radio, and anybody else who is taking the show and putting it on their Internet radio networks. Look, that's why we do this. That's why I do this every twice a week and once a week in New York. I want to thank all of you for putting this on your network and sharing it. Look, I also want to thank those who share the show on Facebook, my wife in particular, but Donna Fan Boyle and others who are really active and diligent about sharing the Facebook live streams to other groups. I appreciate you guys doing it because I think people have to hear some of this stuff because apparently nobody seems to remember any history or they've been lied to so much that they don't understand it. But I thank all of you who share the show. Some of you share the Facebook live stream. Some of you share the SoundCloud audio that we post. You share the YouTube videos that we post. And look, I thank all of you. I want to let people know though, we are our shows are a podcast now. You can go to iTunes and you can search for Let's Talk Native, or you can just search for John Kane, and you can now download our podcasts of our show. So I look forward to seeing how that changes things and where the show travels from here. And, I post links to it on Twitter and I do it on Facebook. So the whole thing is to try to have a conversation, and I want people to understand. Look, I want everybody to be outraged over what's happening with these children, but you can't pretend that this is something new. Look, it might be a new immigration policy, but this stuff has been done before. It's been done to black people. It's been done to Native people. And look, I talked about residential schools, but let me be clear. When residential schools finally ended, and some of them were, in the U.S. were going on until the 1970s, and in Canada in the 1990s. But just because those residential schools ended doesn't mean that kids have stopped being stripped from Native families. That's being done all the time. Look, I know everybody says, yeah, but didn't they pass the Indian Child Welfare Act? Yeah, well, tell that to the father who had his daughter stripped away just a couple of years ago, Cherokee, who lost his daughter to her white grandparents, even though he was the father, because everybody who thinks that we can just get the United States to pass a law to protect us, I mean to tell you, that's pretty foolhardy right there. Let me tell you. I mean, we have to do more because we have had kids stripped from our families. In Canada, they called it the '60s swoop, because we had all of these kids that were taken from families, from parents, and put into foster care, put up for adoption. And of course, one of the ways that ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, is being circumvented is that they're grabbing kids, native kids from the Canadian side, to adopt out to white families on the U.S. side. So the whole idea is about really trying to grab the brown faces, the native children, and turn them into something other than who they are, where their historical and cultural identity is. And this brings me to another point, because one of the things that you're going to hear, I mean, again, listening to Donald Trump speak is like, it makes my ears bleed. But to hear him say, oh, the children are being taken and they're being cared for and they're being treated beautifully. I mean, I literally heard this moron say that they're being treated beautifully. You know, we get into this debate especially from a native perspective, and of course this is another challenge. Even when people think, okay, I'm going to go to a third world country and I'm going to save a child, and there's great intentions with some of that, but if you take a child out of a culture that is in jeopardy of going extinct, and let's be clear, we represent less than 1% of the U.S. population. We were the entire population of of this land, and now we represent about 0.7%. And we are still under an extremely detrimental, genocidal policy of assimilation. Goes on every day. I mean, our battles with New York State over, the governor trying to, shut down our ability to fend for ourselves and develop economies, and grabbing up gaming revenue, trying to shut down even in our involvement in the tobacco business, and making us comply with their laws and with state laws, even on our territories. Look, that's assimilation policies. That's about conforming. That's about Jeff Sessions saying that you have to abide by the government because they're ordained by God. Yeah, that's what that is. But we get into this debate about, okay, but an individual child, if we can take an individual child away from an impoverished people and separate them from that and bring them into a white affluent family, isn't that better for the child? And not recognizing what's wrong with that concept. I mean, I'm sure there's many people listening who say, well, sure, I'd love to be adopted by Bill Gates. I'd love to be adopted by the Trumps and be lavished with all this affluence. Well, see how that works out. You don't think rich people struggle with depression and suicide and all that stuff? Look, I know poverty sucks. And if given a choice between affluence and poverty, any one of us would choose affluence. But if you have to leave your people, your family, your culture, your identity, and you have to have that stripped away just so you can experience that white affluence and that white privilege, and then spend the rest of your life in an identity crisis, because that's what our people have experienced. So yeah, I mean, and look, you can look. I mean, you look at some of the most iconic native voices. The ones who have had success in music and theater and in writing, journalism, and all of these highly educated native people. Many of those native people were stripped from their families, and they were raised by white people. Everybody says, well, see how successful they are? Yeah, some of them do have success. And they also spend much of their adult lives trying to reconnect from what was stripped from them. Are they better off because, well, yeah, but at least they're affluent. People just don't get it. No, it's just not understood. Now, so when I hear Donald Trump saying, "Oh, these children are going to be better off if they're put in custody of the United States," look, they were seeking asylum in a country that they thought they would be safe in, and you start by locking them up and stripping them from their families. I mean, how can anybody not see the absurdity of that? But as absurd as that is, I think it is just a huge mistake, a huge lie, and it is the epitome of white privilege to suggest that this is un-American. This is an un-American practice. It's not, folks. It like I said, this is as American as it gets. It is a part of America's birth. It is a part of America's history from day one. Actually, prenatal. It's a part of their history because it was the French history, it was the Dutch history, it was the Spanish history. Oh yeah, it was a Spanish history. Again, what did I say? 10.7 million Africans were subjected to the transatlantic trade, slave trade. Over 10 million of them were sent to Spanish colonies. Over 10 million of them. Under 400,000 came to North America. So, out of that total influx of 388,000 Africans, the United States, in accordance to their being ordained by God, authorized children to be born into slavery, stripped from their parents. And when we talk about a slave population of 4 million in 1860, or 3.2 million in 1850, or 2.5 million in 1840, those were slaves that survived slavery. That's not talking about how many children perished. Or what was the life expectancy of a slave, or what else those children had to experience: rape, sexual abuse. The President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, right? Famous for having children with a slave. That makes that slave not just a slave, but a sex slave. And of course, what Native people have experienced, being, almost in many ways devalued to the point that we were just, we were actually considered an infestation. That was some of the language that was used. They need to clear the infestation that the merciless Indian savages represented in this country. And what did you just hear Donald Trump say a little while ago, as he was a few weeks ago when he was speaking at the Naval Academy commencement address? That Americans need to be proud of their history. Well, I'll tell you, there's only one way that you can be proud of all of that history. And that's not to know all of that history. To cherry pick. To make stuff up. That's the only way you can. I mean, you're not going to be proud of the history. You're going to be proud of a story. Of a fairy tale that is told about the United States. You've got to convince yourself that when you see something wrong today, that it's the first time that wrong was ever committed. When you see an American policy that strips children away from their parents, you have to pretend that that's never been allowed before. And you got to be outraged. And then, of course, you blame it on party politics. So one party will blame the other. And that's what you heard Trump blaming the Democrats for this. And now people say, well, this is just, the absurdity of having Donald Trump the president. What do you think he represents? I mean, 60 million people voted for that moron. 60 million people share that philosophy, and they are more deeply entrenched. 80% of the Republicans, no, I take it back. I think I said it was 86% of the Republicans support what Donald Trump is doing. All of what he's doing. They are fully backing, whether it's threatening to blow up North Korea, then meeting with the guy that he poked fun of, and then say, "See what I did? I fixed it. There's no more nuclear threat." I mean, what an idiot! To insult and pick fights with American allies. Look, I'm not a big fan of Justin Trudeau, or frankly, I'm not a big fan of any of the European countries or their offspring that have been guilty in the past or are still guilty of genocide. So when I hear somebody say, "Oh yeah, we should be siding with Russia because Russia is standing up to the United States," look, Russia is as guilty of every bit of every crime the United States or China or anybody else is. I don't buy this whole "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." No, they aren't. They aren't. I also don't buy this idea that in order to fix these things, we have to be a part of. We've got to infiltrate. We got to put our best and brightest up for election into state and national offices. Forget about the fact that we have poor representation at home, and we don't have people who are willing to lead our people to independence, to assert autonomy and distinction. No, we don't have that. Instead, we've got everyone saying, "Well, our best hope is to get legislation that's going to fix our problems. So we're going to pass ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act. Yeah, how are our children doing? We're going to pass VAWA, Violence Against Women. Yeah, how are our women doing?" So for all of you who think that there's a legislative fix in Washington, how do you think those children are feeling about what Washington is doing to them right now as they're being stripped and imprisoned, now being holed up in tent cities, or that's what's being proposed? Look, folks, what exists in the United States is anything but a legitimate. I mean, I'm not a big fan of democracy, but it's anything but a democratic process. I've cited Dr. El Sadawi, who says democracy cannot coexist with state religion or capitalism. Because if you can buy elections, and look, this is before Jeff Sessions says his last piece of crap here. But if you can justify what you're doing by saying God said, or it's in the Bible, you've got Jeff Sessions quoting scripture justifying penalizing children as a deterrent to illegal immigration. I mean, and Trump going on about the absolute necessity to have these ultra-conservative or secure borders, building a stupid wall. Why? Because none of these guys really believe that they are ordained by God. I mean, come on. Nobody really believes that. You think the royal family in England believes that they were ordained by God? No, they've been riding that lie for centuries. And now you've got an administration that is so bold in this notion about who they think they are, in their notion of white supremacy, that they will use everything they can to support that systemic racism that that they've longed for. They've longed for being able to institutionalize that racism even more, because let's face it, racism has been under attack. It hasn't been defeated. But Jeff Sessions quoting the Bible, that is exactly what Dr. El Sadawi out of Egypt was saying, that democracy cannot exist or coexist with capitalism rich men ruling everything, and with religion, with state religion. And look, you can believe that there's somehow, and this is what you're taught in school, right? Oh, the United States, they have a separation of church and state. No, they don't. No, they don't. You got the Attorney General quoting Bible scriptures, suggesting that this is how you can justify using children. Look, this is the same administration who thinks one of the deterrents to terrorism is killing the children of terrorists. I mean, I'm not making this stuff up. But if you don't think abusing children hasn't been a policy that the United States has used since its inception, then you're just mistaken. Then you've been lied to. And what was it? And I can't think who I'm quoting here, but there was a quote that says, "It is easier to fool people than to convince them that they've been fooled." Folks, you have been fooled. So you've been lied to, but you like being lied to, so you're going to pretend that it's not a lie. And I'm not just talking about Donald Trump and Jeff Sessions. You've been lied to your entire life. I mean, I just had a discussion with my grandson today. I played him. There's a video. You can find it on YouTube. It's a time-lapsed video of every nuclear explosion that has taken place up to like 98 or something like that. So it's just a map, and it shows a little blip. First one in the United States, native territory, the Southwest. Then two in Japan, 1945. And then as you go through that timeline and you see the calendar, the months tick away and the years tick away, at some point it sounds like popcorn popping. Because the United States has lit off over 1,000 nuclear bombs. All test. I mean, two of them, all but two, right? So they tested one, then they used two. The only country in the history of the world to kill people with a nuclear weapon is the United States. They don't spend a whole lot of time teaching that to children in school. Even when they cover World War II, even when they talk about the atomic bomb, they never put it in its real proper perspective. And now the United States wants to be the moral authority on nuclear weapons? Folks, you've been lied to. And if you believe what the United States is doing to brown faces trying to seek safety for their children is something new, you are just mistaken. You are just wrong. I mean, I get into these conversations. In fact, I've been going back and forth with a few people on racism. People, white people saying, "Well, I've experienced racism." No, you haven't. Oh yeah, I have. I've experienced. One woman was saying that she experienced racism on an Indian reservation. She says, because there I was a minority. I said, no, you didn't experience racism. You may have experienced racial bias. You may have experienced a response to historical genocide that Native people have experienced when a white woman comes in who thinks she's got the answers to help people. If you're a white person and you find that black people don't care for you, that's not racism. So I get into this debate and I get over and over and over. No, if you think if you think there's such a thing as reverse racism, for one thing, if it's racism, it's racism. But there's no such thing as reverse racism or reverse discrimination. It's either discrimination or it's not discrimination. You can't throw discrimination in reverse. If a black person is discriminating against a white person, that's not reverse discrimination. It's still discrimination. But it's not racism. Racism requires a system. It requires a government ordained by God, apparently, that can do things to people who are marginalized, who the people in power believe are beneath them. And if you believe that somebody's beneath you by virtue of race, that's racism. What black children experience at the hands of the United States, this government ordained by God, according to Jeff Sessions, was racism. Oh, yeah, we can call it slavery. We can call it all kinds of other things. We can call it Jim Crow. We can call it all kind. But it's racism. What Native people experienced at the hands of the United States, a government ordained by God, was racism, is racism, still today. Listening to Andrew Cuomo in Albany saying, well, those Senecas, they got a history of breaking agreements. That's not just wrong. That's not just a lie. It's a racist lie. Not from Donald Trump, not from the Republican Party, not from a Tea Partier, but from a Democrat. Look, I got pretty charged up about this stuff. I've gotten pretty charged up about this stuff because it angers me when I hear people misrepresenting this American dream and these American ideals and what they say are American values. I mean, Martin Luther King suggesting, over 50 years ago that he had a dream that one day the United States would live up to its creed, that all men are created equal. Sorry, ain't happened yet, Martin. Ain't happened yet. All right, folks. Hey, it's Friday, so we'll be back here Monday. We'll have something else to chew on then. Again, I want to remind people that this show does go out as a podcast. We will post the show on SoundCloud, so you can pull it up there if you want to just catch the audio. But if you want to sign up for our podcast, you search us on iTunes. You can find us there now, and we'll explore some other platforms. But we're going to try to make sure these audios are available so people can mull some of this over, and perhaps as they hear this discussion and hear this conversation, they'll further the conversation. Let's talk Native, folks. Yahweh.